So are you saying Benjamin Netanyahu deliberately boosted Hamas to try to prevent a Palestinian state?
Yeah, sure. He deliberately and systematically even told, is on record, whoever wants to avoid the threat of a two-state solution has to support my policy of paying protection money to the Hamas.
So what we did, with the permission of our Prime Minister, is to let Qatar to transfer a huge amount of money in cash, probably more than $1.4 billion. By doing it, we increased the power of Hamas. We did everything in order to make sure that Hamas will go on controlling Gaza, and Palestinian Authority will control the West Bank, so they will fight each other.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I'll be joined today again by Zachary Foster PhD, who has a PhD in the history of Palestine from Princeton, to discuss his perspectives on what's going on. Obviously, this is very relevant to the current dynamic between Palestine, Gaza, and Israel, and dive a little deeper with him than our last conversation on some topics, because we recently discussed a lot of these different overlaps of the history of Zionism with him, and I'd like to talk about a few more points that I think are very relevant. Nobody better to talk to about this. So Zachary, how are you today? It's good to have you back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me back.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So I'd like to start with the general perspective of yours. I'd like to ask you your perspective right now with, since this has been something that you've studied for a long time, your life's work, it would seem that you've been studying this. So in your perspective with what's going on in the world right now, what do you see changing the most? And is it shocking to you to see so much awareness around these topics? And why do you think that is post October 7th around these kind of historical lies about like whether Palestine existed and so on, and this kind of rapid awakening to so many lies that have been spun by the Zionist entity?
You're right. We are seeing a sea change in public opinion, not just in the US, but almost everywhere around the world. I think the reasons are pretty obvious. You have a genocide taking place. You have more journalists killed than in any war ever waged in modern history. You have more healthcare workers killed than in any war waged in modern history. We're talking about over 400 healthcare workers, medical professionals, doctors slaughtered, just trying to treat patients. You're talking about aid workers. You have more than, I believe, 200 aid workers killed. You have people going to retrieve that aid being slaughtered at the infamous Flower Massacre. Obviously, the attack on the foreign aid organization that led Biden to shift course. So we're really talking about it. 80% of houses in Gaza have been either partially or completely destroyed. You're talking about the complete annihilation of an entire.
Did I lose you? Still there? There you go. Go ahead. We lost you for a minute. Go ahead. Keep going.
So I think when you're looking at that amount of violence, that amount of brutality, and then at the same time, when you're seeing the United States government, as well as the UK, as well as Germany, as well as most of the G7, as well as most of the major global powers, basically just standing by, either in support outright, as in the case in the US, UK, and Germany, or just completely silent, doing nothing. It's a total travesty. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such an awakening.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, I mean, what we've seen, and I completely agree with you, but it's interesting to me to ask why now? I mean, obviously it's never been this belligerent, this in your face. The statement I make often is that really when you acknowledge the numbers, there's just no excuse that makes that seem okay to the average person. 15,000 children, there's nothing you can lay over that makes it seem acceptable. But there's been times in the past, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, people calling out very serious crimes that in some cases did get a lot of recognition. So is there anything else that you see different today than the many times in the past that this has been sort of covered up by their allies and different governments in the world?
Oh, well, there is one key difference, which is that in the previous wars, the 2008-2009 aggression, known as Cast Lead in Israel, in which Israel slaughtered about 1,000 people, 700 to 900 of whom were civilians. Right. So in that aggression, Israel killed more Palestinians in Gaza than Hamas killed on October 7th in Israel. Okay, but of course there wasn't the same degree of outrage. There wasn't the same degree of solidarity and support for the Palestinians as we are now seeing in terms of support for Israel. Why is that? And I think the answer is pretty simple, right? It's because for the first time, I think in the entirety of this conflict, certainly for many, many decades, for the first time, the victims are also Jewish. The victims are also Israelis. And that's the key difference. I mean, that's the only real difference between this aggression and the previous aggressions on Gaza, right? 2008, Israel killed 1,000 Palestinians. 2014, Israel killed more than 2,000 Palestinians, 1,400 of whom were civilians. So again, like, why was there not the same outrage back then directed towards Israel as there is outrage directed towards Hamas? So again, I think it's pretty clear. It's because Palestinian lives, according to most of the world, certainly the United States, the Biden administration, certainly most of the EU, the Palestinian lives just aren't worth as much.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a shocking reality to some. Something we've been aware of for a long time, but it's really kind of breaking through even in the corporate media, which is interesting. And actually, on that note, since we're talking about these shifting perspectives, why do you think the corporate media is suddenly, in some small cases, and others, moderate, but never the full picture, are suddenly telling the truth in some cases? What do you think about that?
Well, even to this day, the New York Times is publishing headlines that are just, I mean, they're writing haikus in order to basically deflect blame away from Israel, right? It's like with the Flower Massacre, the headline of the New York Times, we could pull it up, I'm sure, but it was basically like literally a string of 3 phrases. There wasn't even a complete sentence. You had no idea who did the killing. You had no idea who got killed. It was a chaotic event. No, it wasn't chaos. It was Israel slaughtering people going to get aid. That should have been the title. Israel slaughters 100 people trying to get aid who are being starved by Israel. That's the headline. But you'll never see a headline like that in the New York Times. You are correct to point out that there has been a shift, but also there's been a shift in the Biden administration, right? We have seen, at least even just in the past couple of days, we've seen the administration come out and say explicitly, we're going to put a pause on weapons transfers, right? After 7 months of genocide, after 35,000, probably more like 40 to 50,000 people slaughtered, if you include the people under the rubble, after 15,000 kids slaughtered. Oh no, finally we're drawing a line at Rafah. I mean, why didn't you draw the line when they committed a mass murder in Shifa Hospital and in the hospitals in Khan Yunis and in the hospitals in everywhere else in Gaza? So, I mean, literally, I think of the 37 hospitals in Gaza, every single one of them is partially damaged. I believe all but 12 are completely destroyed, including.
I think we lost you again.
Yeah, when you're destroying the entirety of the healthcare system, when you're mass murdering journalists, when you're destroying every single home in the Gaza Strip, how are these not red lines? When you're killing aid workers in mass, when you're killing professors in mass, when you're slaughtering. What
of course,
is going on with my internet? I apologize for that.
It's okay. Of course, we lose you when we're getting into the important stuff, as always, but, go ahead, keep going. The point you're making, in case we lost it for the audience, is simply that how can we not see the red lines being crossed with how belligerent this is, whether it's healthcare facilities or any number of other things we're seeing?
Yeah. So I think what I would say is I think the shift in the Biden administration's rhetoric and even policy now with the pause placed on weapons transfers to Israel, I think that the shift is obviously in public opinion in the U.S. It's not in Biden's view. Biden doesn't care about Gazan children. I mean, that's obvious. If he cared about the lives of Palestinians in Gaza, this would have ended a long time ago. He doesn't give a flying fuck about the Palestinians in Gaza. What he cares about is winning an election in November. And he sees the tides turning. He's not a total idiot. He may be a genocidal maniac, but he's not stupid. He sees public opinion changing.
Yeah, I completely agree.
He sees that you have voters writing in saying, I'm not going to vote for this guy. And so I do think that, it was that Michigan vote that played a key role. And there was another vote, I believe, in Minnesota. I can't remember the exact number of people who opted out, who opted not to vote for Biden in the primary.
Right.
But he realized, and then obviously with the campus protests, the largest campus protest movement since the Vietnam War protests in the late 60s. We're talking about the most dramatic upheaval in domestic American politics in a half century. And so he's woken up because he wants to win a re-election, not because he cares about people in Gaza.
Yeah, well, and I completely agree. But then in regard to the media, you think that's the same reasoning? Is that indication of the control of the media, or do you think there's a different reason there?
No, I do think that at some point, these pundits who get on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and who write columns in the New York Times, at some point, I think they're also realizing that a genocide that is going on for this long, where there's just no end in sight, where everyone is starting to I think the way I would describe the shift is, on October 7th and maybe October 8th, you had basically unanimous support for Israel. I mean, almost unanimous. Really, like everybody was waving Israeli flags. People who never cared about Israel-Palestine, who didn't know anything about Israel-Palestine, are putting Israeli flags in their social media bios. And what has happened ever since that day is that more and more people, both in the United States and in Israel and everywhere else, are essentially realizing that Israel's response is increasingly disproportionate and is increasingly genocidal. Because at a certain point, like, Hamas stopped killing citizens in Israel on October 8th, right? Like, there was no, the justification to counterattack, okay, for a week or two or three made sense. But now we're 7 months in. There's no plausible claim here that you're sort of responding to what happened on October 7th. You are carrying out a genocide at this point. So I think that is, and then I think on top of that, what has become obvious to certainly the Israeli military, and also we have CIA and Pentagon officials saying the same thing, is that Hamas cannot be defeated. And the longer Hamas continues to carry out attacks, the longer Hamas continues to fire rockets into Israel, it becomes obvious to more and more people that you just can't achieve these military objectives you set out to achieve. And if you accept that this objective of eradicating Hamas is unachievable, well, then what are you doing? It's just a genocide at that point.
And I would even take it a step further and say then we need to ask whether that is even their objective. And I think that's the real point there, is that that's the narrative spun around what is clearly at the very least, belligerent, indiscriminate bombing of whoever's in the area, which I think it's even more than that. But I agree completely. And I think this goes to the larger point of why Hamas has been used, whether it's the funding or different aspects of it in the past, in that same way, the division of the Palestinian state. I think that's important. You bring up the campus protest. I think that's a really important aspect as well. And you made a really interesting point right there. And it's exactly what we're seeing in reverse, which is usually how this goes, where you had right after October 7th, people who knew nothing about the history, which frankly, most people don't really understand the history there, but that most people didn't know anything about it, were suddenly waving Israeli flags. Well, jump forward 7 months or even a few months, and you've got people in protest who are protesting what is a self-evident crime. I clearly think genocide as well. And yet you got these framings of them where they'd come out and talk to one person in the corner of the protest and be like, none of them know anything about the history of all of Israel or anything about October 7th. And the point I make is, well, first of all, you don't need to understand all of that to be able to acknowledge crimes taking place and feel a drive to stop that, right? But it's an interesting overlap there, all this wild propaganda. You have comments on that, go ahead. But I'd like to ask you more about the protests themselves. And, what do you think it is, the shift there from the different, the two-party paradigm, I think, is so successful at keeping most people kind of trapped inside these narratives, pound to one side or the other, which makes them usually miss the bigger picture. But all of a sudden, and maybe it's the same reason, maybe just the belligerence of this shook them free, but we see this massive protest, which I personally see as more than just one left or right side. I think it's more than that has suddenly changed the conversation. Why do you think that is? And do you think there's any elements of this that we should be concerned about?
Well, I think what we should be concerned about is police violence.
Yeah.
And Israeli protests violence. As far as I can tell, all the actual acts of violence have been carried out by pro-Israel protesters against people protesting against a genocide. Save for that one, you recall that was, I think, a one protester who literally was like faked and getting poked in the eye by a Palestinian flag. It was laughable. I mean, you know, you have Matt Leave and other people literally doing whole like 5-minute sets on this like fake eye injury. But literally, but then if you look at the UCLA protest, they're literally firing fireworks into an encampment. I mean, you can die. That could be lethal violence. And then in New York City, you had a police officer shoot a round, like fire their weapon into the air, I think. And that was, I mean, in my opinion, those were the two most violent events in the past month or two on these college campuses. And so the violence is being directed and perpetrated against the protesters. It's not being perpetrated by the protesters. So I think the narrative, I mean, I think it was Mehdi Hassan who said something to the effect of he's never seen the mainstream media misreport.
Lost you again here for a second. Hopefully you're coming right back. There we go. Misrepresent. Go ahead.
So he said, I don't think I've, in my entire history as a journalist,
they really don't want us having this conversation, Zachary. I think that you just keep cutting in and out.
What is going on?
Yeah, it's so they've never seen something so misrepresented, I think is where you were.
That's exactly right. I mean, you literally have the New York Times, the Washington Post publishing kind of both sides of some stories. There were clashes on campus. There weren't clashes. There were peaceful protesters that were attacked by people waving Israeli flags. That is what happened. And to both sides, this is just honestly so egregious. And then when you layer on top of that, these statements coming out of U.S. congressional officials, the president, all the mainstream media outlets, it's anti-Semitism on campuses. I mean, it's honestly just fiction. It's just absolute fiction. All of the reporting I've seen from the actual campuses themselves, you're looking at peaceful, overwhelmingly peaceful people, you know, serving food, having a health clinic set up, having a library set up, you know, peaceful students, just protesting a genocide. And that is like 99.9% of what you have.
Yep. And I can't tell if you stopped there or not because it cut out again, but I'll jump in really quickly and I'll just point out that the important thing I think as well, as I'm sure you would agree with, is that there were a huge representation, in some cases the majority, because they were put on by Jewish organizations, but a Jewish population within these protests, as well as Holocaust survivors being a part of it, which doesn't have to mean any one thing or the other. It just simply means you can't call it anti-Jewish or whatever the ridiculous narratives they throw over the top of this. And to your point about the protesters, I saw actually more than one example of a person who pretended to like bump his head against a flag and act like he got hit. And then a woman who claimed she was stabbed in the eye and took that all the way to Congress. That wasn't why she was there, but stood there in front of Congress with not even a blemish, saying she was stabbed in the eye, which took place like 2 days before that. You know, it's in the larger picture that we've proven. I'll say first that I have no doubt that there is some element out there who are on the side of whatever you want to call it, anti-genocide or pro-Palestinian, who might say things that are taken to be racist or might have opinions we don't agree with. But it's by and large been shown to be aggressively, not just misrepresented, but flat out lied about, which my point is always, if you have to lie about all these things, it's at the very least not to the level that they're claiming it is, right? And I've seen endless provable examples. I think Stefanik in Congress just got called out by the investigator in an open session where she said they were marching through the halls screaming, "Kill all the Jews." And he said, that's unequivocally false. We proved that wasn't true. And you just keep seeing these narratives floated by people with that kind of power. That's terrifying to me, you know? If you want to comment on that, go ahead.
Well, I would just say there are people making genocidal statements all the time. They're the people that are backed and supported by the Biden administration.
Right.
Okay. Those are the people who are spewing genocidal rhetoric, not the protesters. You had Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister, just say last week, he made another Amalek comment. The Amalek being the people, the biblical Israelites, were commanded by God to annihilate every man, every woman, and every child. And he is repeating this rhetoric in May, and 7 months into a genocide, the same Israeli government that the United States has been supporting for decades and continues to support and continues to ship arms to. You know, maybe there's been a single pause in weapons shipments, but basically support has remained unabated. And so those are the people spewing genocide, not the students. And you know, to the extent that there is an occasional chant here or there. I mean, if you want to talk about like inappropriate chants or inappropriate symbols, the Israeli flag is an apartheid flag.
Right.
every major human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, Al-Haq, B'Tselem, thank you for pulling that up. They've all published, this is a 250-page report documenting, there's no debate. The point being, there's no debate. Israel's an apartheid state. And so if you wave an Israeli flag, you are waving an apartheid flag. That is a symbol of state-supported violence. And now also probable, plausible genocide. When you wave an Israeli flag, you're waving the flag of a state that is plausibly carrying out a genocide, according to the ICJ. But somehow that is an okay symbol to be waving?
Right, right. Well, and even to the point you made about Amalek, this is the wild part to me that's so much hubris. I mean, I'm sure there's better words to call it, but so you have the ICJ openly acknowledging that as a central part of why the intent was there, right? The Netanyahu referencing Amalek, and then they just casually, more than once, by the way, keep referencing it. Like, that's just sticking your nose up to the whole process. You know they're watching, you know, and it's a level of they know they're not going to be held accountable, or at least they believe that. And I hopefully think that's changing. But you're right, and this is what's so interesting about the labeling things like Free Palestine as wink, wink, they mean kill all the Jews. It's simply not real. Now, maybe that's there. Maybe one of them thinks that, maybe all of it. The point is, you guys don't know that. They're making these broad overlap assumptions, and that's not what real journalism is. And I think this is really about trying to frame the entire thing. And I wanted to bring this into one of your, a few points you were highlighting, you kind of something you put in a while ago, but I wanted to go through some of these historical points. You highlighted discussion around the history of peaceful resistance. I think we touched on this before, but I wanted you to go ahead and give me your background on that, because I think it's really important, one, to understand that, I mean, repeatedly, well up into current times, the Palestinian resistance has tried, with like the BDS movement, for example, to go through the channels they were driven into, even though they have a legal right to armed resistance through the Fort Geneva Convention, and yet it gets framed as violent every time. And so go through that history in the beginning of the original Nakba, where it was predominantly, I think, entirely peaceful until they got driven there, and what that means all the way to this day.
I wonder if we can actually start with the present move back, because I think the present stuff is the most relevant. But basically, in the weeks prior to October 7th, there was a nonviolent protest movement that had been gaining steam in the Gaza Strip. There were hundreds of Palestinian protesters, and I don't even think I tweeted this in that thread. I wasn't even aware of this, and I'm someone who was following stuff pretty closely. This was not well reported on. You had a few articles in 972. Haaretz, I don't think, published anything about them. No mainstream media in the West had published anything about these protests, but you were talking about hundreds of Palestinians, unarmed Palestinians, unaffiliated with any group, marching to the wall, and demanding the right of return, demanding an end to the blockade in the weeks prior to October 7th. What was the response of the Israeli military? Violent crackdown, as always. I don't even, obviously you already know the answer to that question, because Israel responds to every protest movement, to every Palestinian protest movement, violent or nonviolent, exactly the same way. It's violence. That is the response.
Lost you again. There we go. Go ahead.
I don't know what is. So they kill all these protesters in Gaza. In the West Bank on October 5th. Guess what happened on October 5th in the West Bank? You had basically a pogrom in Huwara. You have Israeli settlers violently attacking Palestinians who are just living their lives. But kind of backing up a bit, when you're talking about nonviolent protest movements, you of course have the 2018 to 19 March of the Living protests, right? Which preceded these September. There you go. Which preceded these September 2023 protests, but for a period of 21 months.
For those watching, you all remember how this happens when we're, go ahead. Trying to fill the space. Go ahead.
I don't know what to say. My internet is just spazzing out right now.
I mean, we're very used to this at this point, right? I mean, I deal with the same thing on my end, where there's no discernible reason there should be any disconnect, and yet it continues to happen. So no worries. My audience is well aware, well familiar with it. Go ahead.
So for a period of about 21 months in 2018 and 19, you have Palestinians marching to the wall. Oh my God. What is going on?
I still got you. Go ahead.
Okay. You've got Palestinians marching to the wall every week, every Friday for 21 months, demanding the right of return, demanding an end to the blockade. What did Israel do in response? It slaughtered 221 of those protesters. 60 of them were murdered on a single day on May 14th, 2018, the same day that the United States was celebrating Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem by moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Okay, so on that same day, you have Israel slaughtering Palestinians in the dozens. Over the course of that entire 21-month period, 6,100 Palestinians experienced life-changing wounds. And do you know how many Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians were killed in response? 0. Do you know how many Israeli soldiers or Israeli civilians were injured in response? 0. It was a nonviolent protest movement. And what did Israel do in response? It mass murdered everyone protesting. Medics, journalists, kids. It made no difference to Israel. Any resistance to Israeli rule, any resistance to Israeli occupation and apartheid and siege is met with the exact same lethal force. And so, and that's 2018 to 2019. Then you brought up the BDS movement founded by Omar al-Barghouthi, a Palestinian from East Jerusalem, who launched this movement in 2005 and has been gaining steam ever since. And I think we're finally seeing the tipping point now where now you have colleges, for the first time, I believe a college and university declared its intent to divest from companies profiting off Israel's genocide. 2024. So it took 19 years, but it finally happened on a college campus at least. But we've seen churches, we've seen mosques, we've seen other institutions embrace this call to boycott and divest and sanction Israel. But this is, I think, the Israel that we've known for the past 75 years is not the Israel that we are going to know for the next 75 years. This is the beginning of the end of Israel as we know it, right? We're going to see. So anyways, you have and what did Israel do to Omar Barghouthi? They threatened to strip away his residency permit. Basically, they threatened to deport him. So if you say, listen, if you look at the BDS website, it's basically a website dedicated talking all.
I'll just fill in while you're coming back to non-violent solutions and responses to aggressive actions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's, you have the BDS movement that has been embraced nonviolence, embraced international law for 20 years. And
this is a fun little game I guess we'll play, and continuing to be attacked for this. It's so incredible that we have to deal with this, but
do you deal with this? Is this my internet? Because I thought my internet was fine.
It probably is. Trust me, it's not something we're all used to, the gremlins in the machine, but it's interesting to me that it's so consistent right now. It could just be, random occurrence, but it seems to be certain times. But go ahead. BDS movement, nonviolent. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the BDS movement. And I think going back even further, I think what triggered the conflict, the way it has evolved over the past 3-4 decades, was the first Intifada, the first uprising, which was again overwhelmingly nonviolent. The first year of the first Intifada, you had the Israeli army entered the Gaza Strip, and they slaughtered 142 Palestinians. And in response, the people of Gaza killed exactly 0 Israelis, 0 Israeli soldiers, and 0 Israeli civilians, because it was a nonviolent revolt. Certainly, initially it was, but then, of course, because
they continued to kill and maim and rape and pillage, it drove them to respond in kind. And I think that's important. Go ahead.
So in response to Israel's brutality, guess what happened? Well, violence breeds violence, right? Palestinians started to pick up arms. And that, in my view at least, explains the transition, at least Hamas's transition from a charity organization to a militant group. It was, and that has been the case, I think, every time Hamas began to embrace violence to an even greater extent, right? First in the charter, on paper, and then in their first attack on Israeli soldiers
Yeah, the charter is something I definitely want to talk about, and Hamas origin in general. So I think that's an important overlap to what's being used today. Go ahead. So by the way, just so you know, I'm trying to fill in after it cuts out with things. Don't feel like I'm cutting you off if you hear me. Go ahead.
This is very strange, honestly. I don't know what to say. I'm deeply I'm so sorry for this, but basically you have so Hamas, essentially it's a gradual transition to violence. First it's a charity organization, then they embrace violence on paper, then they carry out their first attack on an Israeli military target, then they attack civilians, and then it's not until after 94 when they start carrying out these suicide bombings and killing lots of Israeli civilians. But it's a very gradual transition, and at every point in that transition, guess what pushes them further and further in the direction of violence? Well, you already know the answer. It's Israel's gruesome violence, usually against civilians, almost always, and then usually against children. And so I just think when Israel does not really realize what it's doing right now, if it thinks it's making itself safe, let me explain. Give you another example. In the West Bank, on the eve of October 7th.
And Phil, in general, though, I would argue I don't think they think they're making themselves safe. I argue it's about trying to create the justification to explain its existence in the idea of protecting the Jewish population. Please continue.
So I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit, moving away from nonviolence, but just to sort of round out the point here, that violence breeds violence. And I think when you realize that, you kind of understand the trajectory of the Israel-Palestine question, which is, Zionism is a movement to create a Jewish land, a Jewish state in a land that is non-Jewish.
I'll let you finish. Interested where you're going. In a land that's non-Jewish, go ahead.
There's one and only one way to build a Jewish state in a land that is 90% non-Jewish, right? You have to evict the non-Jewish inhabitants to create the Jewish state. Right. And what we've seen over the past 75 years is that that has basically been Israel's kind of long-term strategy of establishing a Jewish state. That's what they did in 48. And then when they conquered the West Bank and Gaza in 67, they expelled 200,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. In 67, 68, they compelled another 60 to 90,000 Palestinians to leave in those first 2 years after they occupied Gaza. And then they've stripped the residency permits of 15,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They've threatened the residency status of tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank who are basically either they're from Gaza originally, or they're spouses of West Bank Palestinians from abroad, or their children of parents, one of whom is not a West Bank Palestinian. It's basically they froze the population registry in 2000. So they have all these, and then there's the home demolition policy. There's the ethnic cleansing operations in the Safariyata and Khumsa and Khan al-Ahmar and the E1.
Well, since you're cutting out again, I'll bring this up that you were highlighting the demolition in general. I have that somewhere. I was going to show this is nothing screams only democracy in the Middle East like demolishing an entire village because the inhabitants have committed the crime of being the native inhabitants of the region. I don't know if you're back or not. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and then they do the same in Israel proper too. It doesn't even. I mean, this is why people chant from the river to the sea, right? Because it's in Gaza. It's in the West Bank, and it's in Israel proper, where, as you just pointed out, they're demolishing, entire villages. So this is part of Israel's long-term plan, which is, we want this state is for Jews. It's all about Jewish prosperity and Jewish development and Jewish safety and Jewish security. And in a world where you prioritize Jews above everyone else, well, eventually, if you get enough resistance, then you just wind up carrying out a genocide, which is what we've seen.
Right. And I don't think I pulled it up. I'll show this in a minute. This is what I was highlighting that you posted before. And to make your point that you highlighted, what's interestingly seems to get disputed by everybody, unless you show these articles, is that this is the reality of and Avi Shalom has called this out as well, the reality of the nation state law. Now, I think this is an important overlap, because what you were looking at here for those in the podcast is a TV star who stood up to defend this, saying, no, Arabs are equal citizens. And Netanyahu's bucked that. He made a point to say no, and quote, Israel's the nation state of the Jews alone, to make your point very clear. So you just can't ignore what that ethno-nationalist mindset is showing us. It's very, very clear. Now, I'd like to talk about the history that you highlighted there of Hamas and how that part has been used in all of this, because it's very interesting, the time of all this. And I'd like your thoughts on, if ever you feel that Hamas was not what it appeared to be, like if it started as something that wasn't necessarily what it looked like, or if there was a point at which it became compromised and was controlled by Israel, somebody else, when that was, and kind of give me your thoughts on that, because we know as a fact that there was funding going on at some point coming from Israel. And so explain that for the average viewer, like what is Hamas in that context? When did it start? And, how do you see it being used by Israel in the time frame?
Yeah, so in the 1980s, Israel funded and supported the organization that later became known as Hamas. At the time, it was known as.
Since it cut out there, that's interesting, because what we're talking about is the funding from like 2019. Oh, sorry, I just think that's it. What I was saying is interesting that 1980, before it was that, like the idea that you could argue to that point, and I wouldn't have cut you off if you didn't cut out there, is that it was created in a sense by Israel. Is that the idea that it became Hamas, and was that part of the design? Go ahead.
Well, if you look at the statements made by the Israeli officials in charge of that policy of supporting and funding Hamas, they came out in interviews in the early 2000s saying Hamas is a creature of Israel. Those are their words, not mine.
Right.
So, because at the time, Hamas was a relatively small, relatively underfunded organization that basically operated some, they were dedicated to Islamic preaching and charity work, and they built health clinics, and they supported orphanages, right? It was a charity organization. And so it was apolitical. But basically, because it got all this support and funding from the Israeli government, is able to expand and build these networks all around Gaza and all around the West Bank.
So right there, do you think that was a moment that then either by like a byproduct or by design turned them into something else in your mind?
Well, look, the reason they were funded and supported by the state of Israel was owing to Israel's longstanding policy of divide and conquer, right? This is a classic colonial strategy. We all know if our adversaries, in this case, the natives, if the natives are divided rather than united, they're easier to defeat. And that was exactly Israel's strategy with Hamas. The belief was the PLO was our main adversary. The PLO, based in exile, right, at the time was based, first in Jordan, then Lebanon, then it got expelled to Tunisia. But basically, the plan was, hey, let's create a rival. And this wasn't the first time Israel tried to do that, right? They tried to do that already in the 1970s with the village leagues, these are not well known. But again, you had basically municipal elections throughout the occupied territories. And in 1976, the overwhelming majority, something like 2/3 of the mayors and 3/4 of the municipal council seats went to candidates who were pro-PLO. And so Israel was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Like, turns out the Palestinians in the occupied territories also want to be free. They also want to be able to vote for the government that controls their lives. They also want to have freedom of movement. Wow, what do you know? And so what did Israel do? It established these village leagues to try to undermine the democratically elected candidates, right? These village leagues were not democratically elected. They were appointed by the Israeli military.
Right.
And what happened? So Israel took the same approach with Hamas. It was, hey, let's fund this organization to try and undercut the PLO. And we all know where that ended up. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to that point right there, then, do you think in your, just in your opinion, do you think the election that they always point to was a legitimate election? Because I quite frankly find it really hard to believe that they would have allowed a group that they were already framing as terrorists to just, roll the dice and see if they're allowed to be elected, even though they then took action afterward because of it. How do you read that?
It's a very good question. I don't necessarily think Israel wanted to see those elections. There was a lot of pressure from the Bush administration at the time. You'll recall, this is January 2006. The elections were held, and in the previous year or two, the Bush administration, had gone on this, democracy rah. We're going to spread democracy. We're going to, overthrow the regime in Iraq. And then they were planning on going to Iran next. Right? There were all this. We're going to overthrow the regime in Afghanistan. We're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. Right? That was basically the Bush doctrine. And so they tried to do that in Gaza and the West Bank as well, like democracy. And so they were the biggest advocates. It was actually Bush and then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice pressuring Israel and the Palestinian Authority, pressuring them both that there needs to be elections held in the Palestinian territories. And what do you know? Guess what? It was Hamas, the organization that was known to be an organization of the people. They were known to be, upstanding. They were a charity organization. They were basically thought to be a morally upstanding people. Whereas Fatah, the organization that had been in power, led by first Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas after Arafat's passing, that organization was perceived to be corrupt, right? There was an internal PA investigation in 1997 that determined that 1/3 of the budget was just embezzled. It just disappeared, right? And that was an internal PA investigation, right? Like, so that organization was deeply corrupt. Yasser Arafat and his cronies were deeply corrupt. They were also just bad at governing, right? This was an organization that was essentially, kind of a guerrilla organization for its entire history. And now it's trying to, operate a sort of a pseudo government, managing. It's a completely different. Carrying out guerrilla attacks is a different thing than operating institutions of a government. Those are
Right.
very different. It turns out they weren't that good at the latter. And there was no attempt to share power. Arafat concentrated all the power in his hands. So the PA was, of course, I mean, I think had there been any due diligence done on the part of the United States, on the part of Israel, they would have known that Hamas was obviously going to win. Now, let's be fair. It wasn't a sweeping victory. They won 44% of the vote as compared to 41% that Fatah won. So it was that's still a clear win. But it was a relatively close vote, and they didn't win a majority of the votes. They won a plurality.
Right.
So, I would say that, Israel probably would not have supported those elections, right? Because Israel's policy towards Hamas has long been, we don't recognize Hamas's right to exist.
Right.
They have.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we don't recognize Hamas's right to exist. That was the attitude in the early 90s when they deported 400 Hamas officials. That was the attitude, right, in 2005, in 2006 when they won the election, obviously in 2007. And it is the same attitude to this day, with the stated goal of the operation in Gaza today being to eradicate Hamas, right? Well, we'll see how that goes. But that has long been Israel's policy.
And this is the reason I asked this, because of the timing. And I'm sure you've seen this. We bring this up constantly just because it's still interestingly disputed. But even Haaretz citing this, or a clip that I play often showing former Prime Minister Barak saying the same, which is a quote from 2019, just simply highlighting the fact that they were funding them in order to keep them divided, right? So at that time, do you think that was part of that plan, seeing as how, like even to this day, Robert Inlakesh, who writes for TLAV, has highlighted how the PA is simply just kind of like this bully arm of the Israeli state at the point, like even the most Palestinian people seem to regard it that way. So do you think that this was a part of that at the time, that this was, as I think they highlight, they just gave them suitcases full of cash in order to make sure that they essentially kept divided, do you think that played a role? Good.
It's a good question when exactly this attitude came to infiltrate and ultimately dominate the Likud party, and most of the Israeli mainstream, I would say. Was it in 2006 already? Was it not until 2009? Was it not until 2016, 17? It is my understanding that the first public statements made to that effect were made by Bezalel Smotrich. He tweeted in 2017, anyone who opposes a two-state solution should support Hamas, right? And then Netanyahu said the same thing in 2019. The question is, how long were they already thinking that? And I think the answer is certainly, the early 2010s, I would say, at least. Because remember, like Hamas, I think in the 2008-2009 war, Israel had this belief that they could maybe really like overthrow Hamas. I think there was this belief, at least in the initial period, because that was in 2008, in December 2008, Israel carried out a surprise attack on Gaza. I think that's why it's such a great parallel to October 7th. Because in the preceding month, Israel was basically pretending to want to restart a ceasefire with Hamas.
Right.
Because recall, they signed a ceasefire agreement on June 19th, 2008. That ceasefire agreement, and the agreement was Hamas would stop firing rockets, and Israel would loosen the siege. You saw between June and November 2008, you saw a 97% reduction in the number of rockets fired. So you could say basically Hamas lived up to its end of the bargain. Right. But you saw essentially no movement on loosening the siege. Israel just didn't do it. And then what happened was in November 2008, what did Israel do? It broke the ceasefire. It invaded the Gaza Strip with its ground forces and killed something like 10 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And then there was talks from November to December between Hamas and Israel, where there were basically negotiations to restart that ceasefire agreement. But Israel was it was a facade. Israel was just faking it. Secretly, they were planning a ground invasion, which is exactly what they did in December 2008. Again, with the stated goal, I think the plan. Why was it a surprise attack? Because they really wanted to, they wanted to try and eliminate Hamas. And there were statements made at the time by then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert that we will eradicate Hamas, we will destroy Hamas. And then I think what happened at some point after that, I think especially once Netanyahu came to power in 2009, was that the attitude shifted. Was okay. We can't defeat Hamas. That's just not really possible. But there's a side benefit of, okay, so we can't defeat them, but there's another benefit to having them in power, which is that, well, we don't have to even pretend to negotiate. We just say, well, how can we negotiate with terrorists?
Right.
How can we negotiate when the Palestinians are themselves divided? There's no negotiating partner. There's no partner for peace. And so we can continue to expand our settlements. We can continue to expand occupation infrastructure. We can build more apartheid roads. We can take away more Palestinian water. And that was the plan. That has basically been Israel's approach since 2009.
That's fascinating. And there's so many overlaps there we could dive into. I'd like to ask you two more things about Hamas before we move forward. And one's about the charter in general, but going back to the point you made about 94 and the suicide bombings. I mean, I hope people don't miss your very quick but important point about the history of nonviolence before this came about. But interestingly enough, I brought this up many times, and I have your research on this probably, compared to others, is going to be far more than I or anybody else has done. And I'm curious about the timing of this and whether you think the idea of suicide bombings in general. I'm not going to dispute that there were suicide bombings carried out by, any number of other elements or specifically Hamas, but do you think there's an interesting overlap of false flag element there, that this could have been done to frame, to use, to make it look like we're talking about some belligerent, Muslim, Arab, Palestinian terrorist bombing concept? Because I've drawn parallels to what you've seen Mossad elements do or other actions. And interestingly, that we don't see that as common today, despite the fact that they claim it's worse than ever. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say that when thinking about what gave rise to the acts of to this violence by Hamas, like, we're really talking about a tiny number of individuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were something like, I believe, 12 suicide attacks between 94 and 2000, right? And even during those 6 years, the Israeli military slaughtered 3 times as many Palestinians as the Palestinians killed Israelis. So even during this period of time when basically for the first time in Palestinian history, they're really attacking civilians. I mean, we didn't go back to the deep origins of this conflict, which was basically Palestinians embracing nonviolence almost, for many, many decades.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for the first time in Palestinian history, you see these attacks against Israeli civilians, I would say, at least, and the Israeli army just responds with, again, gruesome violence in return, killing 3 times as many Palestinians as the Palestinians killed Israelis. But in addition to that, the Israeli army also, what I would say is they did more than that. They carried out acts of collective punishment against all Palestinians, right? And those acts were they basically imposed lockdowns beginning in the mid-90s. The Israeli army goes into the West Bank and Gaza and erects checkpoints at the entrance and exit points, 600 checkpoints at the entrance and exit point of every single village in Gaza and the West Bank. And so you have already in 95, 96, you have 10,000 families in the Gaza Strip that are going hungry. The World Food Program, the WFP, spins up an emergency food operation to deliver food to 10,000 families starving to death in Gaza Strip in 1996.
Wow.
So Israel imposed these lockdowns as collective punishment. This is at a time during the Oslo process when they're supposed to be building trust, making concessions, transferring over land, transferring over authority to the Palestinians. Instead, they're doing the exact opposite. They're eroding trust. They're punishing Palestinians who had nothing to do with any of the violence. So I'm not actually sure that was the question you asked, but
no, all of this is fascinating and relevant. Like, it's so interesting. You're just obviously such a wealth of knowledge, and I hope people will look to your work to flesh more of, because it'll take days of content to get all that out. So it's important to do that. But so really quick point aside before we go forward, you said 600 checkpoints. I've talked about this before. First of all, that people just dispute that, it's because it does seem like an obscene number. Can you tell me how many that you're talking about? 600 in what span of space? I don't be able to understand how ridiculous this number is. It's just outrageous.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're talking about actually more. It was 600 pre-October 7th. I think they've added about another 100. That's a B'Tselem reporting. I think we're close to 700 by now. But the 600 checkpoints we're talking about, essentially almost all of them in the West Bank.
Wow.
So the West Bank, Israel, the West Bank is 22% of the size, 22% of, let's say, all of historic Palestine. Historic Palestine is roughly the size of New Jersey. So you take 22% of the size of New Jersey, you put 600 checkpoints, now 700 checkpoints in that size of territory.
That's just, I mean, that's overwhelming. And to think about, with people to understand, I mean, this is, you know, consider like the food aid process. Like right now in Gaza, that you're going through this long drawn out process. Robert Inlakesh again has done great work on highlighting the disregard to rights in general, or, you know, just that people can be waiting there for indefinite periods of time. They can be arrested for no reason. Imagine going through 600 of those in a process. I thank you for highlighting that. I just find that to be just egregious. It's overwhelming. I mean, all of this truly is. But to the charter, now this is an important point that we've highlighted before, but the idea that historically the charter originally, or maybe you can correct me on that if it's originally or not, but the one that people point to, the older one, highlights an aim at killing Jewish people. Now the other one they put out makes it explicit about Zionism, about the, you know, the nuance that I think is important. So was that the original that they started with, and was that their original mindset? Was that a misrepresentation? Go ahead and explain that for me.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're exactly correct. The 1988 charter, the August 1988 charter, has language in there that talks about the enemy as the Jews. Look, Hamas is an Islamist organization, right? And so there is language in the Quran, you know, talking about the Jews are the enemies, you know, kill them when, if they come from, you know, you can find anything you want in the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah. You can find very peaceful statements. You can find very non-peaceful statements. And some of these,
real quick on that one point though, is there a translation possibility there? That's something I've heard argued as well, that can, the term Jew being translated, it can mean more of a broad thing coming from the other language. Is that true?
That's a good question. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to speak to that, but okay. I would definitely say that, look, Hamas was an Islamic, I mean, it is an Islamist organization. And so they're borrowing language, I would say, from the Quran and from the Sunnah and from the Hadith literature. So that, you know, and so there is plenty of, let's call it anti-Semitic rhetoric in these texts. By the way, there's also plenty of peaceful rhetoric in these texts. So it's the same with any text. Like the Jewish tradition is the same, right? You have statements where the Jews are ordered to carry out a genocide. The God of Israel is a genocidal God, just so everyone knows. But God is also a peaceful God. So you can find whatever you want in these religious texts.
Right. Same with the Bible, same with many, right? Same thing. Go ahead.
Exactly. Now, you're absolutely correct. In 2017, Hamas amended that charter to say the enemies of the Palestinian people are not the Jews, or the Zionists, which I would agree with. Of course, the people who are hell bent on taking over your country and making you second-class citizens in it, and if you don't accept your status as a second-class citizen, well, you can be deported. But those are your basically, or you can be killed. But those are basically your options. So obviously, you know, Palestinians should be against Zionism. But I would say, look, they long before 2017, it was pretty obvious that Hamas. There were many, many instances over the previous 2 decades where you have senior level Hamas officials making very like overtures that I would describe as essentially peace offers, extensions, you know, extending an olive branch, but they were all rejected again because Israel doesn't recognize Hamas's right to exist. So obviously they're not going to recognize any kind of overture, a peaceful overture. Those came in 2004, 2005. You have Hamas talking about a 10-year truce, a hudna, if Israel agrees to withdraw from the occupied territories. And then obviously in 2006 and 2007, you have the statements published, articles published in The Guardian, you know, by Ismail Haniyeh, by Khalid Mash'al, basically saying the same thing, 10-year truce, if you withdraw from the territories. So, you know, Hamas had long been open to a peaceful resolution to the conflict. It was Israel that had no interest in negotiating with Hamas. Why is that? I mean, I think it's worth stating that because I think someone listening might say, well, wait, I thought Israel's all, you know, Israel, you know, is always, you know, it's the Palestinians that reject peace. No, it's the Israelis who reject peace, certainly with Hamas. Because why? Because Hamas you have to make real concessions to Hamas. You have to actually withdraw. Right. You can't bully Hamas around the same way you can bully around Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas. And that is what Israel got so accustomed to, is basically not an actual partner at the table, but someone who is subservient to you, someone who would take orders from you, someone who would do your bidding and your dirty work. That's what Israel wanted. Israel didn't want a partner. Israel certainly didn't want an equal partner, right? Because an equal partner is someone you have to like treat with respect and make concessions to. But that's not what Israel wanted. And so Israel had no intention of ever agreeing to any of Hamas's demands. By the way, Hamas made peace offers in June 1988, even before the August 1988 charter, right? You have Mahmoud al-Zahar, number 3 in Hamas's command, go to Tel Aviv in June 1988. He presents a document to then Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He says, if you withdraw from you don't even have to withdraw. You just have to declare your intent to withdraw from the territories.
Wow.
And then you have to allow us to hold elections, with no Israeli interference. Then we'll have our representatives that we can then negotiate with you. And again, but Israel had no interest. But again, Israel had no interest in withdrawing from the territories. On the contrary, from 1982 to 1988, in the 6 years prior to this peace offer by Hamas, Israel tripled its settler population.
Right.
It wasn't
all of which are illegal.
All of which are illegal. It wasn't going to withdraw from these territories. It wanted to keep a hold of them. In fact, it was the most rapid expansion in the settlement enterprise, in the extension of Israeli control over the occupied territories since 1967. So, look, that's what I would say here, is that actually there have been many, many opportunities for peace. It's just Israel has no interest in making the concessions it would need to make in order to have peace.
Right. Well, there's 2 points I want to add to this I want your thoughts on the current ceasefire illusion, which I think I framed as the Israel ceasefire long con. But first, I'll highlight one of your tweets that it kind of dovetails with what we were just discussing about the charter and the difference. And, we could all kind of theorize about why that might have shifted, if it could have been a ploy to make you think that they weren't what they are. There's all different ways you could look at it. But here's an interesting point you write. Hamas did not attack Jews on October 7th, nor did Hamas commit an anti-Semitic attack on October 7th. On the contrary, Hamas didn't seem to care at all about the nationality or religion of their victims. Hamas militants massacred 21 Bedouins, none of whom were Jewish. They killed Majid Ibrahim, a Palestinian in Israel, and 5 other Palestinians in Israel. And you go on to make more examples. So can you just flesh that out for us and highlight the contradiction there to the claim and I guess answer why then you think that they're trying to do that, which I think is an obvious answer, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was triggered by that statement made by, it was Biden, said something to the effect of ancient hatreds. I get it. I'm not really, Hamas was founded in 1988. If you want to say the predecessor to Hamas was founded in 1973, the Mujamma al-Islami, but like either 1973 or 1988, I don't think anyone would refer to either of those dates as ancient, right? So what do you mean by ancient? You're trying to, I don't know, like, you're trying to basically like imply that there's this like, centuries, if not millennia long hatred of Palestinians towards Jews. It's disgusting. It's anti-Palestinian is what it is.
I think it's more so anti-Muslim and Arab. Like you're trying to really just kind of clump in all of this as the same concept, which is what seems to happen. And so I just think it's worth pointing out that, look, I'm not here defending what happened on October 7th. What I am here saying, in fact, I even described it as a massacre in that tweet. Right.
What I am saying is that let's not be fooled for a second. If you want to say this was an attack on Jews, well, you are desecrating the memory of all the non-Jews that were also slaughtered on that day.
Exactly.
We're not like talking 2 people. We're talking 80 people. It's just like, wait, this was an attack on Israel. This was an attack on a sovereign nation state.
Right.
A sovereign nation state that is an apartheid state that is continually taking over more Palestinian land and slaughtering more Palestinians on a day-to-day basis. That it was an attack on a state. It was not an attack on the Jews. If you want to attack Jews, well, you can attack a synagogue. I would say if you attack a synagogue and maybe a non-Jew gets killed in the synagogue, maybe the janitor was non-Jewish. Well, okay, I'm not going to claim that that's you were clearly attacking a synagogue. That is clearly an attack on Jews. Right. But you attacked a nation state that 20% of the people who live in it are non-Jewish.
I make this point all the time where it's such an insulting, whether it's from the U.S. entities or the Israeli entities. I make the point every time. So when they say it was attack, any number of ways they frame that, I make the point. I'm like, so you don't care about the non-Jewish people that were present, that were killed, or vice versa, who are held over here. It's overt bigotry and racism that you can see on the surface of what they do on a regular basis. And that's the most infuriating thing to most of us, is that then you get called racist for highlighting what is some of the most obvious racism of our time. It's this interesting, it's Orwellian. What better time to use that phrase, right? But I want to ask you about the ceasefire in general, because we just mentioned that before, that kind of game that's played, even going back to the other discussion you made even further back. So what do you think about what's currently happening with the play on the ceasefire that just happened and the ongoing Rafah, they've been bombing, and the continuation of that post this point? How do you read that? How do you see it happening with the ceasefire? Go ahead.
Yeah, look, I think one thing we know to be true is that obviously Hamas wants a ceasefire and obviously Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire. Obviously, I don't have privy to the negotiations, so I don't know what was said. I don't know it's all rumor and speculation and hearsay. We don't know what exactly was offered. We don't know what exactly was rejected. But what we do know is that Netanyahu cannot agree to a ceasefire because if he agrees to a ceasefire, his coalition will collapse. He will be voted out of office because 80% of Israelis believe he should resign. And then he will be persecuted. He will be tried in court for the 3 crimes that he is being currently on trial for, which are a bribery, breach of public trust, and corruption. So the only thing we can be 100% certain of is Netanyahu has no desire for a ceasefire. The other thing we can be very certain about is Hamas is desperately, obviously wanting. The people of Gaza are suffering to such an extent. Hamas military capacity has obviously been significantly reduced. Clearly, it's in Hamas's interest to get a ceasefire, right? So I mean, that's what we know. Beyond that, I can't really say much.
Fair enough. And I think what the most insulting part that you said there is the idea that for the fact even that Netanyahu, I believe has maybe just recently was about to speak in front of Congress again. I haven't seen it, so I don't think it's happened, but they're about to invite him back. A person who is currently despised by almost all of the Israeli population, that he's being charged or investigated for exact phrasing with breaking public trust or dishonesty in general. But then the U.S. entity, the media, they frame him as some kind of, major leader of today. It's just such an interesting, again, I think the large point is this is why average people have been just like shaken free from their comfortable position before where they can just pretend it's not happening, not look at what's going on over there in Gaza. It's changing. And I'm very happy to see that. I guess let's finish in general with the conversation about both the settlements and the future. Any kind of a lot of directions you could take it which way you want. The idea of what's going to happen. I just have an image I pulled up here or a post about the settlers are already renaming towns in Gaza. We've seen them begin to build things. They're having entire conferences about what the settlements will be, even though it gets denied in general by the U.S. administration, and seeing where this goes and talking about, Rafah and the end game here. Like, how do you see this all going? Just where you think the future will go and whoops, sorry, I accidentally moved you there. And what you think the outcome will be in regard to those settlements with the conversation as it is now. They're contradictory.
It is hard to imagine Israel being able to. I'm not saying there isn't a desire to, but being able to rebuild an Israeli civilian settlement in the Gaza Strip. I mean, my goodness. Like I'd be curious to know who wants to live there. I mean, you're literally talking about a place that has been completely leveled to the ground. There's no infrastructure, the contamination, the diseases spreading. I mean, it's not just a war zone. It's a bloodbath. It's a slaughterhouse, right? So, and then you're going to live there and under the lock and key of the Israeli army. You're going to need, watchtowers and guards 24/7 because you're obviously going to face attacks all the time. So real quick, I think that's exactly the point. I think that it's about justifying the reasoning behind Zionism and arguing that, see, they're being attacked. And this is even the settlements in that conversation as well. I genuinely think that. That's an interesting perspective. Look, I mean, you make an interesting point because what sane human being, there has to be some other reason, right? Because you're going on a suicide mission, honestly, is what you're doing. Right. So I can't explain that. Yeah. Well, so what do you see being the future in regard to what's about to happen? Because so right now, to end in general, we're at a very dangerous point in all of this, right? Where it's very obvious that every element seems to be aware that they've lost control of the narrative and it's just drowning in their own lies. And every moment is one more thing that the ICJ and the ICC are making notes of if that goes the way it should. And so we're at a point now where, as you said, they can't really end this, with Netanyahu in particular, because no matter how it ends, once it ends, that's going to be the ending for him. And so then you got the other elements of their government sort of like chomping at the bit to have their control. And these are some of the most extreme elements that I've ever seen in this conversation. And we have Rafah kind of stuck in the middle of all this, the entire Palestinian conversation. So just where do you see this going? And it's all theoretical, right? But how do you see this playing out? I see things continuing more or less on a similar trajectory that they have been going for the past few months. I think that there will continue to be these sort of low-level at least lower level operations, military operations in the Gaza Strip than there were at least in the first few months. The number of dead Palestinians on a daily basis is somewhere between, let's say, 30 and 100, whereas in the first 3-4 months, it was somewhere between, 200 and 500. In some days, there were 600-700 people killed, right? But literally, so they've scaled back the military operation. They're slaughtering less Palestinians per day, but nevertheless continuing.
Right.
The famine will get worse. Famines don't get better. People don't realize this. There's only one direction to go in.
Right.
We're beyond this. Unless you have, even if overnight you allow all the humanitarian trucks in, you allow all the aid in, and let it get uninhibited to the places where you need to, people are dying already. According to the UN, the statements were made just a day or two ago. Full-blown famine in North Gaza. 600 people literally starving to death. And so unfortunately, those people who are in the worst cases, they can't leave their homes. They're too frail and weak to move. Right. So we don't even know it's happening. There isn't reporting, because the only reporting we have are people who wind up in the hospitals. The 32 or 35 or however many Palestinians who have starved to death by the official counts, those are just people who have made it to a hospital. So we're going to see more starvation. We're going to see more diseases spreading. There's 1 million people who have a disease right now in Gaza. Half of the population has hepatitis A, skin disease, a flu, pneumonia, a cold. They have all kinds of diarrhea. So all kinds of awful diseases. Half of the people in Gaza are sick right now. That will get worse. So it's painful to say these things, but I don't see the Biden administration actually shifting gears. And without a hard stop, without real action from the Biden administration, I don't see things changing in the Gaza Strip. So I think it'll get worse. The humanitarian crisis will worsen. Israel will continue to wage a low-level genocidal war on all 2 million people in Gaza. And Netanyahu will hope Trump wins in November, because that's his best hope for then continuing beyond November.
Right. Well, I get last two things then. I mean, what part does West Bank play in this? So obviously that's starting to, and truly to end on the point of, what do you think then? Because I sadly agree with you. And I mean, it's just this inevitable slow motion genocide that it's very difficult for anybody, especially people that have barely paid attention to this before, to watch. So what do you recommend they do if they're out there watching? In what actions can they take?
I think that we all need to leverage our own strengths when thinking about what we can all do, right? So it could be that if I'm a politician, okay, well then, I can vote. I have a vote in the U.S. Congress. Well, that's about so you can. But if you're not a politician, you can lobby your politician. You can go to a protest. You can share content online. You can if you work at a company or a business, you can advocate that your company, cease its projects and partnerships with the Israeli military. Right. Right. If you're a university student, you can demand that your university divest from companies profiting off Israel's genocide. So I'm not a college student, so I don't have any leverage over my university, right? I don't work at a business, let's say, that's invested in Israeli apartheid or in Israeli genocide. So maybe I can't do that, but maybe I have some other maybe I have a circle of friends that don't know anything about Gaza, and maybe I can educate them, right? So you have to find where you have leverage in the system and use that leverage.
I agree. And I think that's important right now, that as I framed this recently in every show, People versus the Empire, worldwide revolution against tyranny, oppression, and Zionism, framed as anti-Semitism. The first part being the important part is that I agree that I think right now, regardless of the politics or the what you think people may have wrong or what color their hair is, I think it's obvious that right now this is a growing movement of people that see what's happening. And I appreciate you taking the time today to talk about this, because this is so monumentally important. I hope people will just get out there to try to raise awareness about this, show solidarity, talk about what's happening, do a show like we're doing, hand out flyers, for crying out loud. I really believe we're making a difference on this. The sad reality is that I think most people are becoming uncomfortably aware of is that they don't care what we think or say. And really that because of that, we've had less and less ability to have immediate action to change what they're doing in real time, but we are doing it. And I think the more people that stand up, we're watching that change slowly. And I believe that could and can make a bigger difference on, right now, people's lives in Gaza. So thank you for taking the time. Anything else you want to share with us before we leave today?
Thanks so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it, and hope we talk soon.
Okay.
And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.